A busy night of primaries across the country. New York Congressman Lee Zeldin secured the Republican nomination for governor and will try to unseat Democrat Kathy Hochul, who easily won her primary. In Utah, Republican Senator Mike Lee comfortably won his race and will square off against former presidential candidate Evan McMullin in the general election. But in Colorado and Illinois, GOP primaries got some added attention for how Democrats tried to get involved. Both states saw money pour in for more right-leaning candidates who Democrats think would be easier to beat in November. That plan worked in Illinois, but it backfired in Colorado. Let's bring in Kellyanne Conway, former counselor to President Trump and author of the new memoir, Here's the Deal. Kellyanne, first of all, let's put up what happened in Illinois. A couple of big wins for Trump-backed candidates, Mary Miller and Darren Bailey. Mary Miller for the 15th Congressional District, Darren Bailey for governor. We should point out that Democrats invested heavily in both of these candidates, thinking that they might be easier to beat in November. What do you say?
Well, Democrats should worry about getting what they wish for, John. And what do the Democratic rank-and-file voters and donors think about this exactly? You're spending tens of millions of dollars to decide who the Republican nominees are instead of, drum roll please, making sure that women have access to abortion pills and migrants who are coming here illegally don't die 53 at a time, tragically and avoidably, on Biden's watch, coming over, being smuggled through a trailer. So I wonder what Democratic donors and rank and file think of these shenanigans. Also, I mean, J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, he's rumored to want to run for president. Based on what? They're trying to choose his nominee. He must be afraid to run against a Republican who can actually take him on. But we heard this all in 2016. We want to run against Donald Trump because he's a joke. He can never win. He's not electable. So I think I think the old saying that my grandmother used to tell me, that big people, big minds talk about issues and small minds talk about other people, that really applies to the Democratic Party right now. They're trying to fix these elections in favor of candidates they think are going to be weak. Look, in Colorado, I actually went to the Republican convention this year. It's a convention process, except the one guy who didn't do that, Joe O'Dea, he became the nominee. He went through the petition process. So he's already been out there talking to people. And although he's pro-choice, which of course is welcome in the Republican Party, there are not pro-lifers to speak of in the Democratic Party, John. Even though he's pro-choice, he's not for what Governor Polis in Colorado has signed into law, which is abortion basically up to the moment of birth. And last night, Joe O'Dea finished his remarks as the Republican nominee in Colorado. And he's going to he wants to beat Michael Bennet. And he said, I will always put Colorado first and America first. I think the Democrats are worried that they have stale, sclerotic candidates like Michael Bennet, who unsuccessfully ran for president, and even Patty Murray out in Washington State, who's facing Tiffany Smiley, a very compelling candidate. The Republicans have just done a better job recruiting candidates this cycle.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, and let's bring up call for number 2 here. In Colorado, Democrats tried to get Tina Peters, State Rep Ron Hanks, and Greg Lopez in as the nominees, but instead voters chose Pam Anderson, Joe O'Dea, and Heidi Ganahl, who are more moderate, traditional Republican candidates. I want to just ask you about something else that's happened in the past 24 hours. If you're watching Fox News yesterday, you saw Cassidy Hutchinson, Mark Meadows' former top personal aide, testifying about President Trump and the January 6th speech down there just off the mall, and something that happened afterwards as the president was getting back into the SUV, not the Beast, the SUV, to go what he thought was to Capitol Hill, according to Hutchinson. Listen here.
The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol."
Mr. Engel is Bobby Engel, who was the president's chief of detail. There was also another Secret Service agent in that SUV who was driving the vehicle. We are told by sources close to the Secret Service that Engel and the driver are willing to testify that that incident never happened. And Tony Ornato, who allegedly recounted that incident to her back at the White House, says, I never briefed her on that. What do you say about what we heard yesterday and what we're hearing now?
Well, John, this is the problem, not having minimal cross-examination and both parties truly represented on the committee in any muscular way. They're very basic questions. Even a fully recovered attorney like me would have asked Ms. Hutchinson, with whom I worked along with Ornato and the others in the White House. Were you there? Who told you this? When did they tell you this? What was their state of mind when they told you this? Did you write it down? Because it happened a year and a half ago. So why didn't you come forward before that, or have you? Who else did you tell this to in the interim? And I would point out that the spokesman for the Secret Service today said in the 10 days leading up to Hutchinson's testimony, they received no inquiry whatsoever about what did or did not happen to the beast or the SUV that day. And so if you really want to know the facts, you're going to get everybody involved as first-person witnesses and actors in the event to actually testify. But the committee knows what they're doing, and their friends in the mainstream media know what they're doing, because they've done this before with Russia collusion, with impeachments that didn't result in convictions and the like. They deify, I mean, they literally make a resistance hero out of anyone who remotely worked for President Trump or ever supported him if they just go to the other side. Now, she's under oath, so that's important, and she'll have to wrestle with that. But I would just point out to you that it is remarkable for somebody who's not been asked to testify, who was actually there, to say, I want to testify and tell you what happened since I was there. I've discussed yesterday's testimony with President Trump. He called me a couple times yesterday, and I feel like I got his first-person account, too, and he wants to tell, he would like for that to be known also. But again, this is a one-sided committee hearing. I think the committee made a big mistake by not cross-examining some of these witnesses, because one half of the country, at the very least, who's not tuning in, more than one half of the country not tuning in, will be suspicious and just say, well, wait a second, isn't anybody going to ask her what I'm asking just watching the TV as a citizen of the country? So last thing, she did say an awful lot, the gist of which was, or essentially they said, or so-and-so told me. And so you really have to understand, if this were a true court of law, how much of that could be admitted, how much would be objected to if there were an attorney objecting to that. But I think we haven't heard the last about the credibility of this testimony, the fullness and the truthfulness. Last point, she either wrote that note or someone else wrote that note. Right. That's really easy to prove. You could do handwriting analysis. You can get Eric Hirschman to testify. I believe he already has testified. So we haven't heard the last of this, but this is what the left does. And if I hear one more person on TV say Hutchinson had nothing to gain out of this, she can probably get a spot on The View and on CNN. There's a lot to gain from this for folks. Whatever her motives were going in there, let's stop pretending that people like that have not and will not continue to be heralded by the left, who the day before, a week before, couldn't stand them because they work for Donald Trump and Mark Meadows. Meadows takes it hard in my book, and he deserves it. People should read it, and here's the deal. As a chief of staff who was not ready for the election, for a global pandemic, for the unrest in our streets after George Floyd's murder, simply not a man matching the moment. And I think you're going to continue to hear about that also. Somebody who turned over thousands of text messages and emails and then decided he would take the fifth.
Let me ask you very, very quickly, because we're just about out of time here, Kellyanne. If Bobby Engel and the other agent come back and refute her testimony, does it become a case of he said, she said, or does it undermine everything that she testified to yesterday?
That's going to be a decision for the public to make, and I guess the committee. It's not even clear to me who the audience is here. Is it Merrick Garland's Department of Justice, who so far isn't making criminal referrals of any kind? Is it Chairman Thompson at the J6 committee, who I think the first couple of days of the testimony, John came out and said, we're not planning on any criminal referrals of President Trump? Is it Adam Schiff, who the most dangerous place to be is between him and a camera and a microphone? So really, who is the audience ultimately to be judging the credibility and veracity? To what end? I think the end here is political. They don't want Donald Trump to ever be president again. They certainly don't want a rematch with Joe Biden, where you could just compare their two records of accomplishments and then it's not a fair fight at all, or their acuity not a fair fight at all. But I think what changes, John, is this. It changes immediately. Then you have the testimony of an aide who's telling you a year and a half after something allegedly happened what she was told by somebody. Yeah. Third hand, second or third hand, versus somebody, the person that she was very specific yesterday. She said Engel's name. She said Ornato's name. So if you hear from Engel and Ornato, I think most reasonable people who aren't affected by Trump derangement syndrome, for which there is no therapeutic or vaccine, would listen to that and say, I got to give weight to the people who are actually there, whose job it is to stand between bullets and a president of the United States, God forbid.
Well, we will see if they are invited to testify. Hopefully, if they offer, they'll be taken up on their offer. Kellyanne Conway, good to catch up with you. Thank you for your thoughts. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.